right. So I know most of you already know who I am, but for those of you who don't, a little background on me. My name is Katrina Schroeder, and I'm a book coach, editor, ghostwriter, and founder of the Fiction Lab. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I've been working in the industry, mostly editing and then some ghostwriting and coaching for over the last 15 years. A member of the ACES, EFA, or EFA, I like to call it EFA. And then I've got some certificates in editing and developmental editing. So yeah, that's me. All right. So our agenda, because I like to super organize things, as you guys can probably tell, we're going to first talk about what tabletop RPG or tabletop role-playing games are in the beginning. Then we'll talk about how that leads to while you're role-playing through your characters, how that leads to unpredictable situations and helps further develop who your character's true personality is. We'll talk about dialogue and voice, motivations and goals, how your character changes. And then I'll talk a little bit about the RPG that I've made for the Fiction Lab called Field Testing. And then even some, I can't count apparently. Good thing I work with words and not numbers. Then we'll go through a little play scenario if we've got a little extra time. So before we go into any of that, the first thing, and you guys have probably heard me talk about this a million times, but it's really important. Story is about change. So every story is about how a character is changed from the beginning to who they are at the end. So if we take a look at Harry Potter, for example, at the beginning of the first book, he's pretty timid, doesn't feel like he's got a real family. But by the end of that first book, he's stood up for himself and his friends and also realizes that he has found a family at Hogwarts. So we get to see a little bit of a character journey and change from the beginning to the end. So before we go into a lot of this like role playing as your character, it's important to know that the goal of it also is to determine how your character changes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But let's dive into what is TTRPG anyway. Break that out. You've got tabletop role-playing game. So some of those are going to include games like Dungeons and Dragons, which most of you have probably heard about if you don't already play. Pathfinder, Shadowrun, GURPS. I'm currently playing through Alien, and that's really fun and scary. Call of Cthulhu, Fate, there's a ton of others out there. But essentially the idea of tabletop role-playing is that it is a collaborative storytelling game where players create and act out fictional characters in a really immersive world. I'll show some examples here in a second, but I was curious how many of you have played any sort of tabletop RPG before? Oh, is it just me and Chris?
Yeah.
Oh, and Leslie. Is that right? No, that was Chris. Chris, you raised your hand.
Oh, Leslie has to.
Oh, amazing. Yay. Okay, great. So for those of you who we've got a Tom. Tom is joining us. Hey, Tom. Hey, Tom. All right. So yeah, for those of you who have not played, like I mentioned before, it's collaborative storytelling. So the idea is that you have people sitting around a table, sometimes with little miniatures or a map if they're really fancy and fun. And a lot of times with like Dungeons and Dragons specifically, you're going to use dice to determine if you're successful at something or you fail at it. But the idea is that you're playing a particular person or character that's not yourself, running through different scenarios. So you're given options, opportunities, a journey or a quest you can go on, but you're pretending to be somebody else. And I think it's really helpful and really fun to be able to learn about your own fictional character, like as you're writing, who they are by putting yourself literally just like in their shoes. So you're given a scenario or a journey or a quest or something, and you play your character through that to learn more about who they are and how they react to things. So we're actually going to spend this session kind of diving into that. But I like to fill my decks with memes. This is how all RPG players usually like to think that the sessions are going, but this is usually what it ends up looking like. And so we'll have a lot of fun sitting around the table and just pretending to be somebody else, solving problems, and it's a lot of fun. Any questions on kind of what that is before we go into the next bit? For those of you who don't know much about.
Do you write it out? Do you write out what you're going to do, or is it written out for you?
So yeah, there's actually, without spending like going into too great a detail, there's usually one person, I should have stated this earlier, you usually have one person who's at the front kind of leading the story. So they're what's called like maybe a game master or a dungeon master. And that person is going to lead you, the players, through the scenario. So they might have an idea of like something that's written down, or maybe they're coming up with it on the spot. And then you react to the things that they're providing. So essentially the story is written for you, and then you don't really know what you're going into. You're reacting how that particular player that you're playing would act or react.
Cool.
Yeah, it's super fun. I love it. Escapism. So some important things to note too, which will come into play when we talk about playing as your character and role-playing your character, is that one thing that makes an RPG, like a tabletop RPG, really fun is this group, the party that you're putting together, your team. What's great about the team is that you're doing collaborative problem solving. Your role-playing depth is, you're going to actually expand on the role-playing because you have different party dynamics. So you might have somebody who's, super big and strong versus somebody who's very charismatic and usually the face of the group. So they're going to have different strengths, for him, literal strength, that will actually like help foster character growth, interpersonal conflicts, and even bonds. So we'll kind of we'll talk about that a little bit more in regards to you role-playing your own character in the story that you're writing. But this is kind of important to know. It's one of the fun parts about playing, is that you're having to interact and collaborate with other people playing different types of characters. So first, we are going to actually dive into unpredictable situations. So that dungeon master or the game master I talked about is going to usually introduce some unpredictable situation that you have to respond to in real time. So at this point on, we're going to talk about how your fictional character that you're writing, if you're role-playing them, how you can use role-play to help determine who they are, how they think, how they act. And so one of the things that the DM or GM would do is throw you into situations in which you have to figure out who your character is. So there we go. So yeah, one of the things that's helpful about these unpredictable situations when your game master is going to throw problems at you is that it encourages character growth, because you're having to decide and see how your character evolves based off of the situation. So with RPG, you're throwing challenging situations at your character that catalyzes change and growth. So you can start to learn how your main character or the character that you're playing, maybe it's a supporting character you're trying to get the voice of. But you get to learn how they're resilient, any humility, and then maybe some even darker traits like Jimmy here. So the question that you're learning about your character by role-playing through unpredictable situations is, does your character adapt to the chaos, or are they broken by it? So you get to learn a little bit about that by playing through situations. So it's almost like learning through failure, right? So when you're thrown a challenging situation, how your character reacts, whether they fail or succeed. They're learning from that, and then you're learning how they learn. It also helps reveal true character traits. So when a character or person faces unpredictable situations, their true selves are often revealed. So what your character chooses to do in a crisis or a situation says a lot about who they are deep down. So when something happens that is not what they expect, do they act selfishly, selflessly, cowardly, courageously? Are they hesitant? So if we were to actually look at an example, say we've got a protagonist, her name is Nora. She's a seasoned spaceship mechanic who prides herself on her independence and self-sufficiency. So she believes that she can handle any problem on her own and tends to avoid relying on others for help. That sounds annoyingly relatable. So while on a deep space mission, an unexpected meteor shower hits and it severely damages the ship. So at this point, we've got critical systems failing and she's racing against time to fix everything. So in this very high stakes moment, in this unpredictable situation, she's confronted with two choices. Either she can fix the engine herself, like she's always done because she's independent, but that risks not finishing in time and possibly dooming the entire crew. Or she can swallow her pride and call for help from a crew member she doesn't fully trust, ensuring that the task gets done faster, but kind of going against her "I work alone" mantra. So throwing her in this sort of situation that's almost against what her own personal beliefs are, or even just what her misbelief about herself is. Her misbelief is that she works alone or she works better alone. And then this is the lesson that she's got to learn by the end of the story, is how she changes. And so we give her this high stakes moment and it shows the reader, if you translate this to the story that you're writing, it shows the reader how she's growing and how she acts and reacts to unpredictable situations. Any questions so far? So, Leighton actually reminded me of this Kurt Vonnegut rule. He's got a few rules for writing, and this is one of them. So when a character faces unpredictable situations, their true selves are often revealed. So what your character chooses to do in a crisis says a lot about who they are deep down. So we start to learn from that meteor shower crises, we get to see and learn who Nora is deep down. Throwing them in unpredictable situations also expands a little bit on emotional depth. So a lot of these unpredictable situations and surprises are going to bring out deep and raw emotions. Maybe somebody who normally keeps their cool might have a breaking point and reveal some vulnerabilities or fears that they've hidden. You can use these moments to strip away your character's defenses and show them at their most emotional. And this is going to lead to some memorable moments, but it's a lot easier through role play and being thrown unpredictable situations when you have to be your character to determine what are some vulnerabilities or fears that they're hiding and how are they going to reveal those. How does that strip away their defenses? So if we actually kind of go back to the Nora situation, um, if she's always been cool-headed and fiercely independent, but then after this failure where she has to make this key decision, um, maybe during that when she has to ask for help, she starts lashing out in anger because we're seeing a little bit of vulnerability there that she's not used to showing. So then we're getting an emotional outburst that we didn't really expect. So then you can start to figure that out as you're role playing through Nora. But then that sort of outburst also starts to lead to moments of self-reflection. So then that's even more things that you can expand on when you're actually writing, um, where you can spend some time with that self-reflective moment for your character. But okay, before we jump into dialogue and voice, any questions about throwing your character with you playing your character into unpredictable situations or thoughts? Cool. So, dialogue and voice. Um, I know at least for me, I one of the reasons I realized that something like Dungeons and Dragons or any sort of tabletop RPG allows you to develop character voices. I was running into an issue with one of my main characters that I'm writing where I just could not figure out who the heck she was. What does she sound like? Like, I know her misbelief, I know her actions, but how does she interact with vocally or like talk to? What's her unique voice? And then I realized, oh, I just need to role play through her through a scenario or an unpredictable situation and start to get an idea of who she is. So when you're doing a role play session, it helps to be able to like speak as your character would speak and react how your character would react. So then you get an idea and you're improvising kind of dialogue too. You're learning a little bit about their personality, background, and even the motivations of the character that you're playing. So we're gonna dive deeper into that. So one of the things we can learn in that is their emotional range and conflict response. So if you're role playing through your character, it helps you explore how your character is going to respond to stress or conflict, and all of this through like dialogue too. And maybe when they're faced with a heated argument or emotional confrontation, their tone is going to shift, or maybe even the words that they use. So for instance, if your MC might speak tersely when angry, that's enough. I'm not discussing this anymore. Or maybe they're pretty verbose and panicked when they're scared. So then they're going to stutter a little bit more and panic a lot more, and their tone of voice is going to raise a little bit. Something that helps too, I like to do this is I might, while I'm like watching a show or a movie or something, like feel free to keep a notebook and pen next to you and just take note of like what's the emotion that this character is feeling and how is the actor portraying that emotion? How are they showing that emotional range through the dialogue itself? And take note of again like the tone, word choice, and even like the speech patterns they use. All right. Fun things like accents and dialects. Um, so you can experiment a little bit with accents and regional dialects, or maybe even some unique slang. And a lot of this too, you can glean from where your character comes from, like their background. And it might not even be location, it could be life experiences. That's going to affect even how they talk. And then role playing aloud is going to help you internalize how they're going to sound. So you might have one character who's going to say something like, "Ain't nothing I can do about that now," which sounds very different from, "I must say, this turn of events is rather disconcerting." So that kind of tells us a little bit about who each of those characters are. And we're actually kind of gonna do a little thing here where your voice is gonna reflect the personality. So, for instance, you can kind of start to test out while you're playing through your character their different traits. So if we've got this line right here, I find your lack of faith disturbing. This one's pretty obvious. This person's got authority, intimidation. They're pretty cold and concise. Can we guess who it is?
Is that Darth Vader?
It's Darth Vader. That's right. But yeah, like you know from the voice and the way that like the words that are being used and the way it's being phrased, what type of personality traits they have and who that person might be. Another instance we have here. So the problem is not the problem. The problem's your attitude to the problem. Do you understand? So this is showing us that this person has some quirky wisdom. They're pretty unpredictable. They've got some casual charm and they're pretty funny. Any guesses on this one? I made this one a little harder. Okay, I'm gonna give it to you. Obvious now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I may have to steal that quote. I like that.
But no plagiarism, Claire.
I
But
will,
yeah.
I don't know, quote the Pirates of the Caribbean.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, it's now that you see who it is, like it's pretty obvious, but like
Yeah.
that person, like Jack's very quirky, he's very unpredictable, and he's got some casual charm. And then his do the thing. Okay. Um this line here is gonna kind of just based off of what he's saying and how he's saying it really reflects who he is as a person. So it's nice when you're role playing your character to test with different traits and different cadences, different tones, and different words. Okay, any questions on like dialogue and voice before we dive into some action and inaction? Sweet. Actually, before we do into that, are there any other characters, maybe from like TV or fiction, that have just really unique speaking patterns that stand out to you that you could, if you just heard them talk, you instantly know who they are? What are some good examples?
Like a good example, I think, would be Captain Kirk from the original Star Trek.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep. Or even Spock
And
from
Spock.
the original
Yoda.
Star Trek.
That's a good one.
Yoda.
Yoda.
Yeah. So you can always play around with that, like while you're playing your character, like test different ones. Don't be afraid while you're going through a role-playing session to like try out different things. What you start with is probably not going to be what you end with because as you're playing the character and reacting to situations, you're learning more about who they are. So it's totally fine to like start out all loosey-goosey in the beginning and then try and determine throughout the game like who your character is by the end. So it's going to be very different.
And
So, oh, go ahead.
just I think doing that would also make the dialogue seem more real. The more you dive in with the character, the more situations they're in, you can figure out how they would actually speak and make it real.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Um, all right. So let's talk a little bit about action and inaction. Um, So we're a little bit like mannerisms and movement. So does your character have any like signature gestures? I'm noticing as I'm going through this that I'm moving my hands a lot. You guys are seeing the screen and not me probably, so I don't know why I'm talking with my hands so much, but here we go. Uh, signature gesture. So think about like if your character has any quirks or habits. If so, why? There doesn't always have to be a reason, but sometimes having a reason kind of helps further build that character background. So if we look at, for instance, like Elastigirl from The Incredibles, she talks from the right side of her face. I don't know if you guys noticed. And um, she actually does that because the actress, Holly Hunter, she had mumps when she was a kid and it made her go deaf in her left ear. So the
Oh,
actress herself has like an interesting like vocal quirk that Pixar actually just integrated into the character to help kind of show a little bit more of her very unique like talking style. I love little things like that. So again, another reason why it's nice to have like a notebook while you're watching TV of just like pick up on the way, like not just how people talk, but the little mannerisms that they're doing. Pay attention to the little details and write those down. Um, Another example is like signature gestures, like Monk going in and like if he notices when he walks into a room that things are not arranged in a particular way, he's going to arrange it. And then we've got a reason why for him too. His character reason is he's got obsessive compulsive disorder, so that gives us a ton more character depth too that we can actually see. We're being shown that to us through the actions that he's taking. Another one for anybody who's read any of the Mistborn stuff, in the second series of that series, second era. One of the characters he's got this quirk where he always swaps out things of equal value, but this is also what he determines as equal value. So, um, he has this like habit of stealing things, but he's always gonna switch it out for something else. But again, it's something that he thinks is of equal value, whether or not it is. So it's a fun little like quirk. What are some other characters with some interesting like mannerisms? This can be from like books or movies or video games.
Well, I think Quentin Tarantino has a buttload of these kinds of characters.
Yes.
So I'm thinking like the entire cast from Inglourious Bastards.
Hmm.
They all have
Oh, for
signature
sure.
gestures and moves. Yeah.
That's actually a great example too to go back to for the voice and dialogue.
Mm.
Christoph Waltz character, I can't think of his name, like the Nazi who's our like lead Nazi in that story. He has such a very unique way of speaking and the way that he interacts with the people around him. So like, you could blindfold me and he'd start talking and I'd immediately know who it is and have chills go down my spine.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, again, notebook while watching TV. I love it. Start expensing your Netflix.
Mhm.
It's
Oh, good idea.
education.
Yeah.
Great idea.
Yep. All
She made
right.
me watch it.
Yeah, it was homework.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about body language in emotion. So, consider whether or not different gestures that your character is doing is associated with different emotions. So, while you're playing your character, as you're being thrown these different situations and unpredictable situations, like unpredictable is kind of the key phrase there. Sorry if you can hear Paul barking. I think the mailman came by. Um, he's got a lot to say. But yeah, think about what different gestures that they're going to do. So something you might consider is and question is how does your character physically respond to what's happening around them? So if they're very agitated or things in the environment around them is causing them to be agitated, maybe your character paces. And knowing a lot of these two will actually help improve your show don't tell. So once you've got this idea of like how your character physically reacts based on emotion, you can start actually showing us doing these things rather than saying Sally was upset or Sally was agitated. Sally began pacing the room. Or if she laughs a lot when she's nervous, instead of just saying Sally was nervous, it could be Sally started giggling. Just like pay attention to what your character's body language is based off of the emotions that they're feeling and the environment around them creating certain emotions. And that's always going to let you like improve your show, don't tell a little bit. But something to note there too is always consider perspective. So, for instance, like what is so and so noticing about Sally's reaction to things? So I could talk about perspective and show don't tell. Feel free to ask me more questions about that later. But some things you might consider your MC, your main character, might rub the back of their neck when they're thinking. I don't know if anybody watched Night Detective. I think that's what it's called. For True Detective, Night Country, that's what it was called. But Jodie Foster's character, this was a little quirk, and it honestly took me a few episodes to realize that she did this. But whenever she was like really thinking and a kind of honing in on a thought or an idea, she would constantly just rub the back of her neck. And it was very subtle. It took me a few episodes to realize that that was a constant like character trait that Foster was employing for the character that I actually got to see a lot of show. They weren't telling us she was like thinking or really concerned about something or had this big idea. Like we got to just see it through her body language, and it was really subtle and very well done. Um, so maybe she claps when she gets excited or picks her nose when she's really relaxed. Who doesn't do that? Let's be honest. All right. So interaction with an environment. So I've mentioned about environment previously, and how your character is going to react to it, but how does your character move and interact with the world around them? So that's something to think about too. Do they glide and glide? I can read. Do they glide in gracefully, or maybe they stumble clumsily? What's that character's name from Seinfeld who just like slides
Kramer.
into the Kramer? Yeah, like that's this very like specific mannerism that only he has. So
Yeah.
it's very like associated to him. Maybe your character avoids touching things, or again, like Monk, constantly arranging things. So think about how the environment around your character causes them to react or interact with things. And keep that in mind too while you're role playing your MC. So remember, it's a jungle out there, guys. How your character acts and moves is important. See what I did there? It's a jungle out there. Okay, I'm funny.
Yeah, I know.
I like that.
Mom.
Yeah.
Laughed. I was just on mute.
Uh, so also something too is think about what your character's doing when they're not the main character. And what I mean by that is while you're role playing, you know, if say the game master is given a scenario and somebody else is reacting to it or doing something, consider what your character might be doing during that kind of like downtime where they're not the ones immediately doing something. You know, maybe the other character is talking to the shopkeep. What is your character doing while that dialogue is going on? So think about what your main character is doing with their hands or what they're thinking, like how they're maybe they're pacing, like what are they doing when they're not the main character? Okay, any questions on like movement or action and reaction before we jump into motivation and goals? Sweet. All right, so um your characters, and again this goes back to their change, but everybody's driven by their clear and immediate goals. So another actual um writing tip or writing rule from Kurt Vonnegut is to give every character some sort of like motivation. Give every character a want or a need, even if all they're needing is a drink of water. So like always give them some sort of motivation or goal. And the nice thing about like role play is you're given this like scenario. So consider as you're playing through the scenario what your character's motivation is for completing that scenario. So if we're saving a village from a dragon or finding treasure or solving mysteries, you're given these objectives, and that gives your players like a sense of direction and urgency and purpose, and all of that drives your story and narrative forward. And so consider what your character's internal motivations and goals are to the external scenario that they're given. So let's actually talk about like some internal and external goals. So your external goal is going to be, you know, your mission, the quest, the MacGuffin they have to go after. Internal goals are going to be those personal desires, fears, and emotional needs. And what's nice about role playing through these, like role playing through a scenario, aka the external goal, is it forces you to choose your character's actions based on their internal goals. Um, so I know some of you were on the webinar where we talked about, and this is the one that I did before Chris did his combat one, but where we talked about like fighting and writing fighting into your story. But the scenario that I gave there was that you're at a grocery store, there are a few customers there, and somebody runs by and steals one of the 10 water bottles in your cart. So that's one different like goal that you're given, one different scenario on how you might react. But then if we twist that scenario a little bit, you're at the grocery store and it's quiet, except for the muffled den of zombies trapped in the stockroom. Suddenly somebody runs by and steals the only bottle of water left in your cart. Your goals and motivations are going to change based off of those different scenarios. So your internal goal in the second scenario is kind of a little different than your internal goal in the first scenario, but those external goals are kind of the same. So think about how your internal goal and your external goals can coincide and either conflict against each other or work well together. And that can apply also, and very much applies also to while you're writing your story. Consider how your main character's internal goals are driven by the external goals that are driving the narrative forward. So conflict through competing goals. So before I talked a little bit about like the party, so the team members and everything in your role-playing session. So if we've got multiple people playing their own fiction, like their own characters that they've written, each person's probably going to have like different goals. So their goals might even compete against each other. So one character's desire might oppose somebody else's. So if we take this like particular episode from Firefly, which also love that show, um, but there's an episode, it's the flashback episode for anybody who knows the show in and out like I do. But we've got in that where Malcolm, our ship's captain, wants to pretty much maintain his independence and resists being vulnerable, especially when it comes to his feelings for Inara here. So he fears opening up would compromise his authority as captain. Whereas Inara's desire, she wants to connect with him on a much deeper level while also balancing the role that she has on the ship. And so she desires some emotional intimacy, whereas like Malcolm is very like he doesn't really want he resists vulnerability, right? So their desires, though they want the same thing, their desires themselves also start to like compete against each other, and that creates a lot of tension and propels character development. And so it kind of while you're role playing, it does force you to learn how your character is going to react to competing goals. All right. So before we hop into character change, any questions on goals and motivations and how that works, especially with role playing and learning your character?
Does someone stop you if you start going out of character?
You can, like that could be like a table rule, like, hey, you're going out of character, come back. A lot of times, because there's going to be some interaction, what we might call above the table, um, which is going to be like interaction as you versus interaction as your character. So if I'm playing Malcolm Reynolds, then if I'm leaning more and more out of character and talking more like myself, it would be really nice to have somebody to say, "Hey, wait a second, you know, go back to being Malcolm." Okay, so character change. Like I said at the beginning before we dove into this, is that it's important to remember that story, what makes a compelling story, it's about change. It's about how your character changes from beginning to end. And that's what really keeps readers interested. If there's no growth or no change, it's not really compelling. And one thing that's going to help with that is to know your character's misbelief. So like know what the lie that they tell themselves is. So if we go to, for instance, back to Nora, her misbelief is that, or the lie that she tells herself is that she works better alone and, she doesn't need or want help. Um, or rather, she doesn't need help. And so playing through that scenario with the meteor hitting the ship, like that's going to force her to change a little bit and recognize that change. So knowing what your character's misbelief is and the lie that they tell themselves is really helpful as you start to figure out your character's change. So through role playing, what's nice about being thrown these unpredictable scenarios is that it's raising the stakes a little bit. And this is also that whole section when you're writing your book where I keep like, hey, let's raise the stakes more and more. This is why, is because we're trying to figure out what it is your character is willing to sacrifice. So, what is the cost of success for them? So if we think about their physical sacrifice, there are a few different types of sacrifices here for that character. So if we look at physical sacrifice, will they put themselves in harm's way or give up something material? There's also emotional sacrifice. So are they willing to abandon somebody or betray a friend? But then you've also got moral sacrifice. So are they willing to sacrifice on their principles and values? And as you're role playing, there are going to be more stakes being raised and tension being built, and it's going to start to push your character in a direction of determining what they're willing to sacrifice. And as you're role playing, it's a lot easier to like figure out based on their personality or their misbelief, which might be like what they are willing to sacrifice. What does that cost? Um, okay, any questions before we get to the field testing stuff? Sweet. So, some of you actually got to field testing. And essentially what this is I created a little like character sheet and scenario where you get to like build out and test your character in a role-playing scenario. And so you actually get to like build out a character sheet for your main character to learn who they are. And the idea is like if we look at, for instance, like a Dungeons and Dragons character sheet, you've got all of these stat blocks and all this information that is, helpful to know while you're playing. And honestly, one of the reasons why I love playing D&D, because numbers and organizing stuff. But it you have to have this stuff kind of pre-filled out before you go into the scenario. Which while you're role playing your fiction character, your main character that you're trying to write, the whole purpose of field testing and the whole purpose of role playing them is to figure out who they are. So I wanted to create more of like a character sheet that you were allowed to essentially fill out while you played. For those of you who don't have copies of this, I'll send it to you after this. So you can also just have it and use for your own character role play. But the idea is that you like fill out the character sheet as you role play your character to learn more about who they are. Things that are helpful to have filled out before you start role playing is maybe what their misbelief or lie is, if you know that, or some of their external motivations and some strengths and weaknesses if you happen to know those. But again, all of this, the goal is to fill it out as you start to play and throughout gameplay. So then as you're playing, you start to determine what those voice and speech patterns are, so you can list those here. Something that's important too is how they react to imminent danger. If they're being shot at, what is their physical, emotional reaction? So yeah. Um, so we've got about 10 minutes. I actually created like just some really short, quick one response scenarios. So feel free to shout out what your character would do. But essentially the idea is I'm gonna give you a quick scenario and then you'll at least either think about or say what your main character would do. So WWMCD, what would your main character do? I'm gonna make wristbands. So, first scenario, and think about you can do this either for the main character that you're currently writing, or if you don't even want to do that, if you just want to like pick a fiction, like your favorite fictional character, kind of get their personality in mind, put yourself kind of in their shoes, and then yeah, so I'm gonna give you a quick scenario here. Merchant offers you a mirror for free, but warns you that it shows the deepest truth of the soul. Do you take the mirror, test it, or avoid it altogether? So what would your main character do with this mirror? It's for free, but it would show the deepest truth of your soul. What
I,
would your main character do?
I think my main character would take the mirror, but he wouldn't use it because he already thinks he knows who he is on the inside.
Accurate. Accurate.
Mm.
Who
I
else?
think I think mine would take the mirror, not use it, and as a prank, put it in one of the other coven mates' bedrooms so they look in it accidentally.
Oh, it's hilarious.
Yeah, I think my main character could use it as a tool to help her out with Gasta, her enemy.
Yeah. Oh, I like this of like you're also thinking like so much in their shoes that you're determining how else would they use the mirror. I gave you three options of the mirror, and it's really cool to see that some of you are already like, oh, I'll do this with it, or I'll do this with it, because it's what their character would do. So yeah, that's great. Next scenario, you find a priceless artifact in the ruins of an ancient temple. A local villager insists that it belongs to their people, but a wealthy collector offers you a fortune for it. What would your main character do? What would you do?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah. So you've got you find a priceless artifact in an ancient temple, but a local villager says that it belongs to their people, but you've got a wealthy collector who's offering you a huge fortune for it. Let's go put it in the British Museum. What do you do?
If my main character was hired by the collector, then he would follow the collector's orders to the T.
What would he want to do? Or is this dependent on their character change?
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Before the change, my main character wouldn't care. He
Mm,
wouldn't care what the local is saying. Just let me do my job so I can move on to the next job. After the change, I think he would probably listen to the local
yeah.
and challenge his boss or the collector. He would challenge the collector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
My-
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say my character would ask the artifact, "Where do you want to go?"
Ooh.
and not listen to anybody else. And whatever the
I
artifact
like
tells
that.
her,
Yeah.
that's where she'd put it,
Yeah.
and fight
I
like
like
hell to
that.
keep, to do what the artifact says to do.
Hmm.
Well, one of my main characters is a social anthropologist, so he's gonna want to hide it from the collector.
Mhm.
Hmm.
The one that used to be an attorney is gonna say, well, why don't we try to make both parties happy?
Yeah.
And loan it to the British Museum, but the villagers get paid if the villagers agree.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure what the other one, because there's three, so I'm not sure what the other one would do. So that is, she's like between those two.
Mm. Oh,
So
I
I'll
like that.
think about that.
I think mine would listen to the villager, but originally probably wouldn't even pick it up because she knows a trap when she sees one.
Oh,
Yeah, that's good.
Or is she gonna Indiana Jones it?
yeah.
Leave it alone. Don't touch it.
Yeah, don't touch it.
Let somebody else touch
Um,
it.
yeah, I think so. Jumping back to Chris, your response for this.
Mhm.
Um, it's something too while you're role playing your character, consider where they are in the change. Um, and what part of their, like, do they have this misbelief? Is there a new misbelief? And where they at along that, like, that timeline of change? Because that's gonna obviously, as very evidenced in Chris's response, was that like his character is going to do something very different at the beginning of his change while he's got this misbelief versus what he would do by the end of the story. So, yeah, love that. Any final questions so far? I've got one more slide.
Yeah. Do you plan on doing a field testing in the future?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes. I actually on my task list, it is written on my paper, like right there, that I'm gonna schedule some yeah, I'll tell you here in a second, Leslie. Um, I will schedule some stuff in the lab for field testing, so we'll have that coming up soon. I just wasn't sure with the holidays if it was good to do it in December, or just start the first one out in January. So I'll throw a poll up in the lab. Speaking of the lab, and also to answer Leslie's question, so the Fiction Lab, it's a community that I've created. for speculative fiction authors, but we've also got other authors in there. I think we've got a couple in there writing thrillers, and then even Ashley's got a nonfiction that she's working on. But it's very collaborative. We do these webinars once a month. So, paying for the webinar outside through like Eventbrite or something, you've got access to that. But then if you sign up for the lab, I think it's like $3 or $4 a month, $3 or $4 more than what you paid for the webinar just per month. And then you have access to all of the cool things like these webinars, the recordings from previous webinars, actual sessions of field testing once I get that scheduled, a book club. So you can learn about the more webinars like this either through thefictionlab.com, following that on social media too. And I'll also continue to post these
All right.
webinars through Eventbrite. So yeah. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And Leslie, I'll also email you the character sheet, the field testing character sheet. So you can use that for your own play testing. Yeah. The end,
I can
guys.
attest, it's the best thing that I've ever done.
Oh,
Yeah,
This
same.
has been
Same.
just
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
This has
Yeah,
just
I was
been
going to
great.
say the field testing was great.
It was
I had
fun.
yeah.
so much fun.
It was so
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Claire and Chris were like my first testers. And I had a really because I also played my character. We had Leighton run as the GM, and I got to like test it from the player side and get an idea of like, does this work? Doesn't it work? But also get to learn more about my own character, and it was really helpful for me. So I'm glad it was helpful for you guys too, and fun. That's my goal. Make it fun and helpful.
Yeah.
Remember when we were talking to Becca Fox the other day, the author? We read her book for book club, and she said that she only has 1 hour a day to write. And then, she went on and she's thinking all day long about what she's going to write. And this would be just perfect, when we're doing our other things that we have to do, we could be
Yeah.
role playing in our mind. And this, it's like I needed one more thing to think about, but yeah, I love it.
Yay. Oh, I'm glad this was helpful. I'll put the recording up on the lab. And then also for those of you who are not in the lab and came through Eventbrite or anything or outside to watch this, I'll also email you the recording so you have access to go back and rewatch it. So yeah. The end.
Just-
That's it, guys.
Yep. That
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Good to
Of
see
course.
everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You too.
And just a comment about the field testing exercise we did. I did not really know who my character was until we did the field testing, and I realized how flat he was. So it helped me beef up my character.
Yeah,
I've
I can
noticed some
see how it
improvement
would.
lately too in your character. Like
Yep.
he's a lot more nuanced, I think. So
I
yeah.
would say the same thing with Chris. I actually picked the character that I always had like in the background, even though she's one of the main three. And now I feel like she's moved up.
Mhm.
So it
Yeah.
it really helped me a lot figure out what she would do, and that it was I had her as passive, but it made me realize that there was a strength underneath that in
Mhm.
her
hmm
that is helping me bring her out. She's more three-dimensional, like Chris said.
Yeah. Very
Yay.
flesh.
Okay.
This is more like a game, and so I don't feel like I'm
Yeah.
working.
Yes.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
the goal. I like to gamify everything.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I'm so glad it was helpful. Yeah, I'll get a session scheduled and I'll drop a poll in there today to find out, do you guys want to start this month or January on our first field testing session? So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Excited.
Good.
All right, guys. I gotta go let the puppies outside before they eat and destroy my house.